I am always pleased to welcome my next guest. We've known each other for years at this point. Of course, I'm talking about veteran journalist and author Jack Cashill. Jack, welcome back to the show.
Hey, Jason, always good to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Beautiful home there. You're looking well, Jack.
Yeah.
And you've been vindicated. After 18 years, you were the first person to say that Barack Obama did not author the book Dreams from My Father. You've now been proven right. Why don't you tell us exactly what's going on?
Yeah, this is just the fun. My wife's a university professor, so she subscribes to the Chronicle of Higher Education, which is the Bible of that industry, of the academia. And so she had come across this. I don't know, she just does word searches on me just to see if she could show her face at at department meetings. And she came across this article that I had missed. It was by a guy who had written an article attacking a professor, or a scholar of some sort, attacking my inference, more than inference, my proof that Barack Obama has significant help with Bill Ayers, the terrorist emeritus, in writing Dreams from My Father. In fact, this is the subject of my 2011 book, Deconstructing Obama. And I had seen the original article. What I did not see was his oops. He came back and said, I was wrong, right? He said, now we have independent confirmation that Cashill's thesis is right. Now, I have to give him credit for making that acknowledgement, but you know how retractions are. They get buried and no one sees them. But what he did not do, and he had the opportunity to do, is to go public with this revelation. This is the Chronicle of Higher Education. This is a major, major story. This is the kind of story that a straight, someone from the mainstream media could win a Pulitzer Prize for if they took it one more step. But instead, he just, thank you for the apology. I even forget his name already, but nonetheless, it remains buried. And that got me to thinking, though, Jason, because I came across this discovery in September of 2008, when the race was still viable for president. John McCain, okay, but still, it's not Barack Obama. And I couldn't find initially a mainstream conservative magazine, that would give me the wording, the word space I needed to make my case for Ayers' authorship of Dreams. So, it was, by the way, I should say, the Dreams from My Father, written in 1995, it made Obama's career. They announced him the best writer to run for president since Abraham Lincoln. They overpraised it. But again, it was enough to launch his ship, basically. He made his bones based on the back of this book. And so in September of 2008, when I realized that Ayers was the primary author, or certainly largely responsible for the quality of the content, I went and looked for a conservative publisher of some reputation to give me the space I needed to make my case. I had been writing for the Weekly Standard. They wanted nothing to do with it, right? And I went to National Review, nothing to do with it. You name a publication, Human Events, nothing to do with it. I said, all you have to do is just look at a couple books and verify my information. It's not like I'm asking you to confirm that TWA Flight 800 was shot out of the sky. That's, a task of a higher order.
Separate story for another show.
Yeah, right, exactly. I get that. That would take weeks to do a confirmation on. It would take a lot of work. This you could confirm just by looking through a few books. And I'm talking to the literary editor of Weekly Standard, and he said, it doesn't really fit into my schedule, but stop this. You're not trying to win this election. Finally, the American Thinker, which I had not even heard of, an online publication, and hats off to Thomas Lifson, the publisher, agreed to run it. I did it. I needed 3,500 words minimum, and that's how much he gave me. Rush Limbaugh picked it up that day. And when he starts talking about you on the air, Jason, your life changes, right? I mean, just overflowing with, emails and turn on the radio, Jack. You talk about blah, 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 all that kind of stuff. So this is on, I think it was October 8th. We're now 4 weeks before the election. David Remnick, the the editor of the New Yorker, the most prestigious editorship in the country, would later acknowledge if this theory were proved true or even believed to be true by enough people, it would have ended Obama's candidacy because Obama lied about his relationship with Ayers during a Democratic debate where he said, I was just some guy in the neighborhood. Well, this guy in the neighborhood, Marxist in your neighborhood, the terrorist in your neighborhood, you allowed him to crawl around in your head rent-free for however many years to help you write this book. And it would have changed the outcome of the election. For a month, I was holding the October surprise, right? I had it in my hands. It's an unusual feeling. But then as the days passed, I could see the right or the establishment right totally running away from the story, wanted nothing to do with it. I tried contacting Congress people, et cetera. No, they were already out looking for new jobs. The people in the Bush administration. They didn't want to know. I went to Washington to knock on doors, made no progress whatsoever. So I can't hold the guy at the Chronicle of Higher Education to too much contempt because he at least acknowledged it. These other people wouldn't. Now it's common knowledge. I mean, essentially on the right, everyone sort of knows and believes that what I'm telling you is true. So people will come up to me and they'll say, Jack, did you know that Bill Ayers helped Barack Obama write Dreams from Her? Yeah, I heard that story. Yeah, somewhere I heard that story. But that's the way the world rolls. We're getting closer, to truth telling on our side. Meanwhile, the mainstream media gets further and further away. They don't even care anymore. They just say whatever comes into their head, and they're content with it.
But Jack, isn't it always the case that this stuff comes out? Like you said, you knew about this in 2008 while the election was still going on. This guy apologized. Like I saw your Substack just the other day, and I thought that this had just come out now. I'm glad that we're talking about it because, even when you go to that article from 2008 or 2009, the link to this actual apology, it's a dead link. I had to go to the Wayback Machine. I mean, how many people would think to do that? But here it is in 2009, this guy says he was wrong. So, I mean, isn't it always the case with all this stuff, whether it's 9/11 or Butler PA or Charlie Kirk or whatever it is, we don't seem to find out the true answers to these things until 20 years later, and it just doesn't matter anymore.
Well, in this case, when I knew the date of the original article, but I did not know the date of the apology. I mean, like I said, my wife just discovered it. I went back and I had someone find it for me also, the actual apology. And what he did is he traced his, mea culpa to the book by mainstream best-selling author, Christopher Anderson, who wrote a book called Portrait of a Marriage, about Barack and Michelle. And he had on-the-ground sources in Chicago's Hyde Park confirm, that Bill Ayers took over the book project and did it. I mean, that's nice to have that at some point. But the trick is, and Jason, this is where there's a double-edged kind of sword here, because sometimes I think we chase conspiracies that are not solid and legitimate, and that ends up wasting valuable energy that we need to devote in our fight against the communists in our midst.
Yeah. It's like those gorillas in the mist that were hanging out with Sigourney Weaver.
Yeah, right.
Now,
Jane Goodall, right?
Yeah. But, I mean, the thing is, a lot of people still don't, I think, understand who Bill Ayers is and why he's still relevant. Everything that's been happening with Antifa and the George Floyd riots, it's not just it's not just a sequel or a tribute. Some of the same people who were involved in the Weather Underground have created these things. And I mean, they're so much more sophisticated now. I mean, look, Obama became the president. Arguably, that was the infiltration of the Weather Underground into the U.S. government. Look at what's happened since then.
No, you're absolutely right. And Bill Ayers, very typically, I mean, in the 60s when these people emerged, actually the 70s was really their real strong decade. But the energy came from the 60s. They once they were busted, and they eventually all virtually busted. Bill Ayers got off on a technicality. They went into education. Ayers is an educator. That's his pride and joy. And one of the giveaways in Dreams from My Father is that he takes his own education platform that he had for the Chicago schools, and as a white guy, he really had little power to enforce this because he was afraid of the black bureaucracy in Chicago. He didn't have the racial credentials to attack it. But his plan, is, as best I could deduce, is that he wanted to use Barack Obama not to become president, but to become mayor of Chicago. That was his goal. So he could reform the Chicago schools in his own light. He had written an article roughly at the same time Dreams came out, in which his point-by-point plan for Chicago schools is exactly mirrored in Dreams from My Father. Now, Barack Obama never talked about education otherwise, but he gives them the platform, he puts it in there. He was hoping, and this was, several people mentioned this because, was it Walter Washington had become mayor of Chicago, first black mayor, and people were talking about Obama succeeding him. But as president, oddly, Obama does Ayers no good because once that connection became public, he really had to keep his distance, which meant also that the quality of Obama's writing cratered after Ayers got exposed. So there is I guess, a silver lining there for someone.
Yeah.
No, but you're right, exactly right. These people, Ayers was in his 20s then. Now these guys Ayers is now pushing 80. They were deeply invested in the whole infrastructure now of the new communism that's been being spread largely through our educational institutions.
Yeah. And, all these, as you said, these things are being exposed, and we're finding out so much from not the mainstream news, but people on X and their own platforms and whatever, just digging into the Epstein files and all that. It seems that there are more connections between certain things. I'm not suggesting a connection between Bill Ayers and Jeffrey Epstein, but have you and I ever discussed this New York Times article that was published on Tuesday, September 11th, 2001? Obviously,
I've read it. Terrible timing for Bill Ayers.
Well, I mean, it's amazingly ironic. He says he doesn't regret setting bombs, right, and he feels we didn't do enough. Of course, the targets of the Weather Underground were the Pentagon, the Capitol, banks, right, everything that got hit on September 11th. Don't you find that coincidental?
I mean, you think about Bill Ayers' day on September 11, 2001, right? He gets up in the morning, he sees his New York Times. Honey, look at this. I got this great review. About me being a mad bomber. I don't regret bombing. I'm a big fan of terrorism. And then like an hour later, he becomes a total pariah, absolute pariah. I mean, because the notion of a terror bombing all of a sudden took on much more ominous tones than he could have imagined early that morning. So it was a shocking day for Ayers, I'm sure, and it cost him. It took him a few years to recover. That was a real blow. And by the way, Fugitive Days, the book in question, which was his kind of magnum opus, is a really good read. If you want to learn about the period of what these people were like and what they were doing, and it's unapologetic, which makes it more interesting. But and just in the way of background, Jason, I didn't read Dreams from My Father until the summer of 2008, and then I was trying to find out whether Ayers and Obama had met up before they got to Chicago, before Obama got to Chicago. And so I picked up a copy of Fugitive Days and I started reading it. And then I said, bingo, this is this is it. And as soon as I saw that and I began to test it and do word tests and comparisons and whatnot, I said, I had to laugh. I said, it would have been so much easier if I could, because I knew Obama didn't write dreams. I thought it'd be some left-wing poet someplace. I could make a minor splash saying Obama didn't write dreams, and people would have run with it because I would have said, poet Joe Polanski, whatever, actually wrote dreams or helped with write dreams. That's the national reviews of the world would have been okay with that. But when it's Bill Ayers, it's just too good to be true, right?
Yeah. I mean, that's one way of looking at it, of
Yeah.
course. And so, but Jack, Obama continues to pollute and destroy Chicago with his Death Star, the land-based Jackson Park, whatever this thing is going to be. There's no records in here. Nobody has seen any of the Barack Obama presidential records since he left. And also, I mean, in this age of internet, what are they going to store there? Who's going to go to this library to look anything up about Obama? It's ridiculous.
Well, plus it looks like a fortress. It's like designed to keep out curious researchers. And, I thought that Stalinist architecture was finished, but apparently it's making a revival in Chicago. It is what an unwelcoming building that is. It's just curiously brutalist in its style. I'm not sure. I know there were lots of minority contractors involved, and maybe they said if we just build something straight and square, we can get the job done. But it's a real testament to Obama's heritage, his legacy. And what books will be in there? Will we be able to see finally the early drafts of Dreams from My Father? I don't think so.
No, I don't think so. It's funny, I'm having a little technical problem here. My mouse has disappeared. It's amazing, Jack, the things that you've discovered over the years. And so has Barack Obama ever acknowledged this in any way? Obviously, it doesn't seem like something that he would do.
No, he has not in any which way. And his apologists continue to ignore or suppress the story. I was just oddly today, just right now, I was looking at Grokpedia and on Dreams from My Father. And they give a very fair description of the work I had done, and such, et cetera, for several paragraphs. And they don't dismiss it. In fact, then they bring in Christopher Anderson's confirmation. So, I mean, Grokpedia will, huge improvement over Wikipedia, which is a politically manipulated, manual operated, basically disinformation sheet. Grokpedia be fun that way. No, they will not. And, it's interesting in his most recent memoir, he wrote a memoir that almost no one noticed, paid attention to, called The Promised Land. I believe it came out in 2020 or 21. And in which he basically disowns the whole Kenya story. And then he just dismisses it all like it didn't happen, right? Because it really didn't happen. His Obama Senior was never a part of his life. It's unlikely he was even a sperm donor. It's quite likely he was a beard. They just needed a name to put on a birth certificate. I think he had something to gain by doing that because he was allowed to extend his stay, his visa, student visa in Hawaii, by having a pregnant American wife. And my theory in this case, and I'm not sure I'm correct, but I think I am, is that she was already pregnant. His mom, Ann Dunham, was already pregnant when she got to the Hawaii in September of 1960. And then they had this desperate search to find, and they knew the child was going to be black or blackish, and they found someone who would be willing to own up to it for his own advantages. It's the one theory that makes most sense out of all the data. And what it does is explains why they went to such desperate efforts to protect the birth certificate. Because if the birth certificate said he was born in February, the date she was allegedly married, 1961, not August. Then the whole Obama myth is blown. The whole, goat herd from Kenya, girl from Kansas, that whole thing is blown. He based his whole candidacy on that story, and the story was false. I mean, even after he was born, and this is it's interesting, Jason. This won't surprise you, but it might some viewers, is that all the mainstream biographers skipped over the fact that now proves, and they finally admit, that Obama's mother, in August of 1961, weeks after his alleged birth, moved back to Seattle, where she was from, and without the father, without Obama Sr. He was never a part of the life at all. There was no 2 years my father left for Harvard, all BS. And yet these major biographers, Pulitzer Prize winners like David Remnick and David Maraniss, write these biographers going with the Obama mythology. Goat herd from Kenya, Kennedy plan sends them together, blah, 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 end up falling in love, an improbable love, and abiding faith in the nation. They have this little love child, and then they stay together until Harvard calls 2 years later. They just went with it. It's a remarkable failure of journalism. And it's more than a failure. It's a conscious rejection of journalism in favor of propaganda.
Yeah. Well, and that's all we've been getting is propaganda. I think I might have recovered. Here we go. So, and of course, you're familiar with Joel's revelations about Frank Marshall
Sure.
Davis and all that. That does seem to be correct, that he would be the father. I mean, and also, anybody who went into the stuff that you were just talking about with the birth certificate and all that, Jerome Corsi was so just villainized Corsi. They practically destroyed his life up into the Trump administration. This is vindictive people, right?
Yeah, in fact, and the point that is sometimes overlooked is that the same people that Obama used to first to defend them against challengers, which started with Philip Berg, a Democrat from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, former deputy attorney general of the state, Democrat Hillary supporter, started in 2008 looking for the birth certificate with lawsuits. The firm that they used to block them, same firm that they sent to Hawaii in 2011 to retrieve the birth certificate, just happened to be the same firm that created the Steele dossier, Perkins
Huh.
Coie.
Ooh.
They invested millions in keeping the birth certificate out of the hands of anyone who could see it until they had it sufficiently doctored. Joel and I go around about this, and Susan Daniels is also a private investigator that we're good friends with. She has her own theory too, but I've read all the mainstream biographers, and sometimes you have to do that to get some basis and understanding background that I wouldn't have access to. But she was a wild child in high school in her senior year. She had an open affection for men of color. The family pulled up stakes abruptly in the summer of her senior year. Anne was kicking and screaming. She didn't want to go. They had some lame excuse because her father had a job opening in the retail furniture business. His mother's the breadwinner working for Seattle Bank. They move abruptly to Honolulu. I'm sorry. I remember 1960, girls in my neighborhood, when they went to Honolulu or Madison, Wisconsin, or some aunt's house in Wyoming, we know why they left. This is pre-Roe. You went and you spent a few months and visiting your aunt, and you came back. Everything's fine. Little baby's adopted, and everything's taken care of. But in this case, if the baby is going to be black or blackish, where else are you going to go to give that kid a fighting chance in 1961? But the most openly accepting state in the Union, Hawaii, and that's where they went. And I believe that they went looking. I think Frank Marshall Davis may have been involved. In fact, he may have been the guy back in the homeland who impregnated Anne.
Looks just
But
like him.
yeah, because he talks about that in one of his books, of having friends in Seattle, blah, blah, blah. And it was a novelized book. I forget the name of it right offhand, but pornographic. Uh, and but I believe the baby was conceived in the mainland. Whether it was Frank Marshall Davis, I don't know. But I think that is what they were trying to hide. And unless you know how deeply invested they were in the mythology of Obama's having this like almost mythical birth, the most covered birth since Jesus was born, uh, you would not understand the depths of their resistance to letting this out. It was game over if it found out he was born in February.
Yeah, I mean, obviously his whole background appears to be falsified. What do we know, Jack? I can't recall over the years if I've asked you about these various Obama mysteries, but he worked after college for something called BIC. And there's this really strange picture here. I guess this is him teaching at Columbia, but he's got this thing on the board that says relationships built on self-interest. And it's corp, banks, utilities. And then here it looks like it says DE and GOP. So I don't know what that means, but he's erased it and written it on there. Do you know what this picture is of or what he's talking about here?
No, but if this is probably from his University of Chicago days where he was like an adjunct professor. Adjunct professor is kind of a junk job. And if you're a young black guy with a Harvard law degree and you're teaching as an adjunct, that means they don't trust you, So he's probably just making stuff up and put it on the board. I don't know. I don't know what that photo, what that final box and alludes to.
It's weird. But as you said, they've infiltrated education. Bernadine Dorn, who was also Weather Underground, she was teaching a class at Columbia University about torture paradigms and practice. Have you ever heard anything about that?
No, I have not. Have not. That's worth looking into, given the renewed interest in things QAnon and Pizzagate-ish,
And what do you think about that, all this stuff that's coming out in the Epstein files, and how does it tie into any of this stuff? Of course, we've got Rumler, is her name Jennifer?
Rumler?
The lawyer.
Yeah. Right. And she was not only just a lawyer, but she was she was the vetted the candidates for ethics, right? In the Obama administration. That's a heavy lifting job. Where do you begin with that one? No, she was we're talking hundreds of exchanges with Epstein, enough to cost her a job. Where is it? She had Goldman Sachs, was she, or
something like that? Yeah, Kathy Rumler is her name.
Kathy Rumler.
Yeah, Goldman
I
Sachs.
was offered a book deal on Epstein, and I, maybe 6-9 months ago, and I turned it down, partly because I didn't think that we would ever be able to do a couple of things that would make the book worth writing. And that is, one, determine how he died, and B, get hard evidence of crimes committed by, the people of consequence. But we've gotten instead, which is pretty useful in its own way, it's a lot messier, but it's useful, is we've gotten to see just how vast was this conspiracy. It extends deeply into Europe, and that's where the heads are really rolling right now, and especially in England, in high places. And these aren't people necessarily who went to Epstein's Island or who flew on the Lolita Express, but people who were involved deeply and inappropriately with Epstein well after he had already served time, at least in his country clubbish way, for his crimes committed and that he was charged with back in, I guess it was 2008. And that's where it's interesting. And with every new revelation, people are sweating over every email they see, every phone call they get, every tweet they posted, there's someone who's sweating. And, we've seen already some people who've been sweating enough that they've cost them their jobs. I mean, people like Larry Summers, for instance, who is the Treasury Secretary and president of Harvard. Uh, and what the media are finally beginning to catch on to is that this is, at its core, a Democratic scandal. I know there's some Republicans involved, but um, Trump is not one of them. Howard Lutnick, I guess, is probably their biggest fish yet. Um, and I don't know how deeply he was involved. And then there's also the occasional innocent person who just had some odd transaction. Or in Trump's case, where they're talking about him all the time because they're talking about ways to sabotage him by tying him to Epstein, which hasn't worked so far. So it is interesting in its spread, but it has given QAnon and Pizzagate new legs. And in my, I wrote my book, Ashley, the untold story of the women of January 6th. That was the first time I got into QAnon. And the reason I did is because uh, I'll tell you immediately, within 24 hours of Ashley Babbitt's death, the New York Times the next day ran a story, and the headline was something like, Woman shot at Capitol, embraced Trump and QAnon, right? At least half of the 10 women I profiled had their names linked to QAnon. The one woman I found most sympathetic in many ways was a woman who worked in the Cleveland public school system who was deeply concerned about sex trafficking among children. And she walked into the Senate chambers with a sign saying, pay attention to our children, stop trafficking them or something. She was photographed on January 6th. She walked in through an open door. She was in a Senate chamber, an empty Senate chamber for 10 minutes. The people at the Cleveland School District saw it, ratted her out immediately. And by January 8th, 2 days later, 36 hours later, the FBI was at her door, right? Busting her, humiliating her. Got sentenced to, I believe, 11 months in prison. Had to share her cell with a man, pedo who had been now dressed as a woman, right? Lost her job, her house, everything. Couldn't get a job now because she's a convicted felon. And
Wow.
that's typical. But her interest, she had a deep interest in child sex trafficking. And we now see that interest was not ill-gotten. I just saw this morning, Jason, you probably saw this, an interview about, I guess it was from 2020, of Savannah Guthrie interviewing Donald Trump, right? And she wanted him to denounce QAnon. And he says, I don't know much about QAnon. And then she said, well, QAnon is blah, blah, blah. And he says, the fact that you just told me that QAnon is that about blah, blah, blah does not make it true. He said that to her, He says, here's what I know about QAnon, is that they are
Local
against
tax experts
child
are
sex
here.
trafficking. And any organization that is against child sex trafficking has to be doing something right. And then as I was researching this, I got into the Pizzagate stuff. The woman who's led this crusade is a journalist named Liz Crokin, and Crokin, a real truth teller, and the person who needs to be rehabilitated because it cost her career of trying to expose this stuff. And then when there is a movie that she appears in called, what's it called?
Out of Shadows.
Out of Shadows, right? Boy, you watch that, and in that movie they decode and deconstruct the Podesta emails. If you don't come out of that thinking there's something very deep and demonic going on here, you're being naive, because there is. And I don't know if they eat children. I don't know. I wouldn't go that far, but they eat the proxies of children. They use, things like pizza as like, hey, can you bring over a pizza tonight? Just one slice will do. So things like that are clear, euphemisms for children, for trafficking in children. And then they show the art that's available in their homes, and it's
Yeah.
dark, dirty, deep. Hollywood is deeply tied into this. We know that. And
I remember when all that stuff was first breaking, and what's amazing to see now is, it used to be that just even mentioning it would get you immediately kicked off of YouTube, but now
sure,
you've got all these mainstream things talking about it, like, they're like, oh yeah, remember that? We knew all about that. And now they're talking about grape soda and pizza. A lot of people think these are
yeah,
codes for various bizarre acts. I mean, this thing runs deep. That movie that you're talking about, there's a bunch of things that I know about it that, see, there's so many layers to this, Jack, where I agree that Pizzagate and everything Epstein was doing is deep and twisted and weird. But a lot of times that movie, there was so much weird stuff around it when it came out. And there were some people involved in it, Kevin Shipp and things like that, that when I started asking him some questions about it, I don't know, we don't want to get into it on this interview, but that movie in particular, I'm a little bit, I don't know, suspicious of. Not that what it's saying isn't true and correct, but anytime somebody comes forward telling the truth about something like this, the evil people who are behind it, they go right to the story and they get on it and they try to inject additional sort of, improbable elements to make people basically think that the whole thing isn't true. And then they say, oh, well, see, I mean, this is what they tried to do in the first place. They say, as you're saying, there's images, there's coded language, there's things that a lot of people rightly believe refer to child trafficking and child torture and other things like that. But then they'll inject falsehoods like, oh, Hillary Clinton runs a pizzeria and that's what Pizzagate is all about. And they say, see, that was false. So the whole thing is false. It's such a deep topic that we should discuss more. But let me just take you back to our lead here, because of course it's all about you being proven right years later about something that at the time people said was a conspiracy theory, right? A lot of people thought you were crazy to say Barack Obama didn't write the book. You said you didn't want to write this Epstein book because you didn't think we could find answers to questions like, how did he die? What about the question of if he's even dead? This image on the right is the guy photographed by the New York Post on the gurney, and this on the left is Epstein. It doesn't seem to match. Look, his eyes, his nose, his ears, totally different. And I mean, there's somebody else who found a set of handwritten notes just released in the Epstein files. This guy's a behavior analyst and a handwriting analyst. He says it looks like escape plans from prison, talking about amounts of money and also all these weird things. The guards being asleep, the cameras being off, Kash Patel and Dan Bongino not wanting to talk about the missing minutes of the tape. What about the possibility that Epstein was exfiltrated from the jail and he might still be alive?
And Jason, you made a good point about how people, uh, sometimes on our side and sometimes on the left, will inflate a story. On the left, they inflate the story to discredit it. They'll add details that are crazy, and then their people will throw those details in and make the whole thing seem like eating babies. I don't have a lot of faith in the Democratic Party. I don't think they're at the eating baby stage yet. Killing babies, yeah, they've done that way beyond that. Eating them, no.
Not all
And
of
I
them, at
would
least.
say that to something like, which your theory here. Now, it's fun to throw theories out, but if you're writing a book and it's going through a legal review and you're talking about people with very deep pockets, uh, my I had concerns about, and I had, by the way, a very, very inside co-author who knows everything, as much as anyone could know, who is my proposed co-author.
About Epstein?
Yeah, yeah, who's just impeccable in her sourcing and her knowledge, and she lives in that world. But she did not have enough evidence to convince me to go forward with this, because what we're going to have to say, I think, to make the book worth saying, is that uh, Epstein didn't hang himself, and that X person X, Y, or Z was responsible for the execution. Uh, and that was a task that was too tall. I simply wasn't going to be able to do that without, I could tell you this, here are 10 likely suspects, right? But I wasn't going to be able to get better, closer than that. And the theory that you just proposed, there are anomalies in every case, and I argue with I'm considered a conspiracy theory. I consider myself an anti-conspiracy theorist because in a really solid conspiracy theory, all evidence points in the same direction. If there's a bit of counter evidence that's valid and suggests something else, you just simply can't overlook it, you know? So I'll just, for me, the people, this is too big a thing, but I've argued with the 9/11 people a lot on this. Because to me, you need a theory of the case, you need a logic, and you can't deal with counter evidence. So people tell me that, oh, a missile didn't hit the Pentagon. No, I could prove that to you that a missile did hit the Pentagon. I'm sorry that an airplane hit the Pentagon. A missile did not hit the Pentagon. Things like that. So
We have
you
like
cannot.
50 shows here that we've got to do.
I know. The and I'll tell you what, when you get into 9/11, when you argue with people who deeply invested in 9/11, be prepared because you're getting to get it from both sides, and you could tell the difference because I mean this is a literal example. Uh, I wrote a series of articles. I ended up writing through, basically arguing that what you saw happen on 9/11 is pretty much what happened on 9/11. There may be wrinkles, but it's pretty much what happened. And then I'd get like on the right, you witless government shill. That's a quote, right? I'm a conspiracy theorist. I'm being called a witless government shill now, right? And on the left, here's the difference. You fucking government shill, right? Their use of profanity is something like 18 times more likely in a given stretch of emails or posts. And not want to get into that, but just my own theory of conspiracy theories, it starts with the logic. Why would someone do this? Now, in the case of Epstein, there is a logic. There are people who would really like to see him dead. And there were people probably who celebrated on hearing that he was dead. Uh, at the same time, once you get beyond that logic, you've got a lot of hurdles to jump over to make it that next step that he was murdered. Now, yeah, when you look at the fact that the cameras are broken and these guys are sleeping, then you run into the real obstacle for a conspiracy theorist is that how incompetence clouds the picture so often. It's so hard sometimes to tell incompetence from conspiracy. And in the case of Metropolitan Correction Center, yeah. And you're right, those people were disciplined for falling asleep on the job. And, you know, and it opens the door to consider that, yes, this is possible. But I wasn't able to make it to that next step. My next step had to be, here's who did it, here's why they did it, and here's how they did it. I couldn't do that.
You just brought up a good point. These guards were disciplined. It's an interesting contrast to the January 6th defendant who you were talking about, where they immediately descended on this woman, destroyed her life, put her in jail. We've got these horrible crimes happening. And, by contrast, we're hearing the FBI doesn't even have evidence. This is another one of these weird Pizzagate-ish paintings. This is done, I'm not sure who the artist is, but this is allegedly Jess Staley, who I'm sure you've heard of. He was involved in JP Morgan and Chase. This looks just like him. And there's an email in the Epstein files saying, say hello to Snow White. Here we've got someone in a Snow White costume in a bed here. This was, people are finding things in the Epstein files. It seems like the FBI has completely failed, Jack, and all we've got is independent investigations, which inevitably lead to the kind of disagreements and clashes that you're describing.
Yeah, I would say, well, for 4 years under Biden, they didn't look, right? They didn't want to know. There was no effort made to get at the heart of this. But also, there is a lot to be said for crowdsourcing by amateur sleuths, right? And that's how I got involved with the Trayvon Martin story through the good work done by the conservative treehouse. They had busted the case, within weeks. And they were partly because there is among amateurs who are technically sophisticated, they have the time, they have the energy, and they have the passion, and they have no one telling them no, don't look here, or moving some pile or there. Same was true with say the shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson. So many of these stories are busted by amateur sleuths. TW 800 totally done by amateurs. So I wouldn't rule that out. Anytime an investigation gets bureaucratized, as we saw with Epstein, absolutely, where you have so many different arms of government involved and gazillion files, and I think it's good to get them out there and let everyone go at them, right? And see what they can find out, and see what they could discover.
But at the same time, what's your opinion of Kash Patel, Pam Bondi? Everybody expected they were going to come in there and, based on what they were, at least Kash Patel and Dan Bongino, based on what they were saying on their podcasts, everybody thought they were going to, clean house. And now we've just got, just more document releases. We've got this release about Butler PA. I had a lawsuit against the Butler ESU, the Beaver County ESU, the SWAT team. I presented evidence that they falsified the photograph of the dead guy on the roof. It's Maxwell Urick.
Well,
it's not.
Yeah, here's where I lose some people.
Thomas
I'm a
Brooks.
big Dan Bongino fan. If he's not telling me the truth, I don't know who's telling the truth in America today.
You still are a Dan Bongino fan?
Totally, even more. And I've been listening to his show since he came back on. And he explains what's happened, why, the whole, what they have to go through at the FBI. Because you inherit an FBI that where half the agents are going to resist you at every turn. And the other half are probably just going to hold their fire until they find out which way the wind's blowing.
How is that an effective agency if they're resisting what is it? It's just a collection of 17,000 rogues who do whatever they want?
No, not rogues. You don't need 17,000. You just need 100. And then you need other people who are just ideologues or partisans who will just drag their feet or slow down or, put it off. I have a lot of respect for Kash Patel. I have less respect for Pam Bondi, but she is at least loyal and was feisty in her, Senate hearings. My problem with Pam Bondi stems from her role in the George Zimmerman framing in the state of Florida, rolling over on that one. But as Attorney General, I think she's doing okay. And I think that the attacks on Patel and Bongino, and I wrote an article about this because I saw the problem that was happening. I'm totally disappointed in Tucker Carlson, just to be honest. And here's the thing that got me was this. He was writing about, he did that documentary on Butler, on the shooting. And the first half, it was good because he's attributing to the FBI motives that made sense for Biden's FBI to have. In other words, there's a theory of the case. There's a logic behind it. There's a logic for Biden's FBI, Biden's Secret Service to obfuscate and to delay, et cetera. But then when Patel and Bondi and Bongino come in, what Tucker Carlson did is it just slid those same motives over to the new FBI as though there was no difference. Well, those motives don't make any sense anymore. It doesn't make any sense for, especially Dan Bongino, who's a Secret Service guy. It doesn't make sense for him to consider to cover up a would-be link here with in Butler with Thomas Crooks. Although, Thomas Crooks, when you look at it, I just wrote a piece on this, not to get off the track, but he was quite possibly transitioning himself sexually. And when you look at the photos, you can see it, and his interests were really kinky.
He wasn't even there that day, Jack. This is.
Okay.
Yeah,
I'm behind the curve on that conspiracy. I'm sorry.
The guy on the roof is Maxwell Urick, and I challenged the police. If I were wrong, they could have. What I said to them basically was, I pointed out technical reasons why the photograph presented in the report they gave to Chuck Grassley was doctored. and I wanted them to provide the original photo from the detective's phone. They refused to do it. I got an unredacted copy of the after action report, had to be by accident. I did a right to know lawsuit against the police, and I got all the names of all the federal agents and all the cops that were involved. Did you ever hear my phone call with the counter UAS operator?
No.
Rafael Eduardo Castro. I had all the names of all the federal agents. They shut down every single thing that I was doing. The lawsuit, I just got, completely nowhere with that. If I were wrong, the police could easily present that original resolution, unredacted photo, unedited. They wouldn't do it. They had lawyer after lawyer for a year and a half fighting me on that. Additionally, Max Urich's sister came out of the woodwork on X telling me, oh, here's a picture of him with a cat. And I said, well, look, if he's still alive, go do a podcast with him. How do I know this picture of him with the cat? It doesn't surprise me that his sister would have pictures of him that aren't broadly available on the internet, but his mother wasn't answering the phone. I went to the mother's apartment. It was vacant, ladders up, the place being repainted. You know this guy, Doug Hagman. You know Doug Hagman.
Well, yeah.
Out of nowhere, Doug Hagman calls me when I'm getting into all this Maxwell Urich stuff, and he tells me he went to Urich's apartment and he spoke to Urich. And I said, really? He told me the address. I went there in Pittsburgh. No Urich. There were Amazon packages waiting at the door. Wasn't addressed to Maxwell Urich. I said to Doug Hagman, how did you know it was Maxwell Urich? He said, the landlord addressed him as Max. And I said, yeah, but you didn't know that it was him. So I called Doug Hagman back to ask him about all this. He's never answered the phone since then. Turns out he was hired by Jack Cashill to do this investigation for Jack's book. So I saw Jack outside of Madison Square Garden. I said, Jack, why didn't you say anything about the second bullet trajectory? There was a bullet coming down the back row of the bleachers, identified by two people being simultaneously shot, and then the bullet hitting the rail. John Cullen initially identified this. Eli Crane, the congressman from Arizona, he found it so compelling, he tried to get Cullen to testify in Congress, which he refused to do. But there was just so much evidence of such a much more complicated thing going on in Butler, PA, than simply Thomas Crooks on the roof. Not to mention, there's 3 videos of someone with Thomas Crooks' father after the shooting wearing a hoodie and a face mask in the middle of July in Pennsylvania, going to the lawyers, going to Walmart. Sounds a lot like a 20-year-old spindly kid. Why is he going around wearing a face mask? Same individual was seen outside the parents' home, face mask. Nobody was wearing COVID masks by 2024. I don't think it was Thomas Crooks, and I think it's being totally covered up, just like Epstein. And I mean, we say, oh, Biden's FBI, Trump's FBI. Doesn't it seem like something else dictates the direction of the FBI rather than the actual president?
No. It's odd because, I've written many books on major conspiracies. TWA Flight 800, the death of Ron Brown, Barack Obama's authorship, et cetera. And I just have a high standard that I adhere to if I'm going to, especially put a book together. I got to have an airtight case. And I mean, it's my job to make it as airtight as possible. So for instance, and then that's why what bothers me about, nothing personal here, Jason. What bothers me about conspiracy theories today, and this has probably been true forever, is that, and I like the idea of starting to piece things together. I like the idea of people like yourselves piecing things together, finding alternate threads, looking for explanations that are beyond the orthodox. But I need to see a logic pushing it through. I need to see a reason why people are doing X, Y, or Z. So for instance, when I did the Ron Brown book, I got much closer to the truth than I thought I would. When I was offered a nice contract to do a book on Ron Brown's death, and he was the Commerce Secretary of Clinton who died in a plane crash in Croatia, 1996. And I said to the publisher, I said, I'll take the contract under the understanding that sometimes planes just crash, stuff just happens, right? And I said, you've got to be willing to live with that. And they said, okay. So I said, what I focused on is why the plane went up, right? And I figured that I'd never be able to figure out why the plane came down to any degree of confidence. But then I had a breakthrough that stunned me. And that is that when I sent away for the Air Force, I realized the Air Force had done a voluminous report on it, 22 volumes. And no one in the media had ever requested it before. And when I sent away for it, I first got back from some functionary who said, oh, this costs multiple thousands of dollars and take months and months. And I had a summary of the report, and I thought, okay, just have to live with the summary. And then I get an email back. I write him back, said, I'll just kind of live with the summary. Then I get an email back from a colonel that says, it'll be there in a week. We're waiving all fees, right? The report came on a pallet. It was so big and voluminous. And I'd worked on it, the TWA 800 book with several TWA captains who knew their, you know, aviation much better than I did. So I gave them all the technical detail, and then I took all the non-technical detail, the interviews and everything. And at the end of the day, we all concluded, no, this plane was sabotaged. Ron Brown was murdered. And I had a reason. I had a logic, strong logic, because Ron Brown's business partner and confidant, Nalanda, was cooperating with me. And she told me why they wanted to kill him. I mean, it's involved. You could read the book and find out. But I had the whole thing. But I couldn't close the door on it. I could say that the dispassionate observer looking at the evidence says, yes, Ron Brown plane was sabotaged, almost assuredly by Croatian intelligence, working in conjunction with the Clinton administration. But I can only prove this to about 95%. I can't close the door. I can't name names. I can't tell you exactly how it came down. This is as good as I'm going to get, just got to live with it. So I lay open the possibility that sometimes planes just fall out of the sky. That's a possibility. I don't think it happened here, but I just laid out the evidence and let the reader, make up his own mind as to which thread made most sense to him. So, and what we'll get in, we could do the crook stuff some other time. I have to kind of run in a few minutes here, but it's always fascinating to talk to you. And I like the idea that you stay a step ahead, because someone's going to stay there. And sometimes when you stay a step ahead, you just walk into a pile of dog shit. Other times, you kick open the door that needs to be kicked open.
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, I don't claim to know the full answer. I'm just saying, I guess what we're talking about, Jack, is basically two different approaches. I'm like a dog with a bone. When I find a piece of evidence that can't be explained and people say, oh, that doesn't mean anything, I'm going to talk about that evidence until it leads to the next thing. I agree with you. I can't explain the motives, the whys, who did this. I would attribute that to there being large aspects of the case that I just don't know about that might explain those questions. I just think that there are, in all of these things that we're talking about, certain elements of evidence that are so inexplicable that they just have to be explained before we can accept, frankly, any story. But I want to thank you for joining me today, and thank everybody for watching. Make sure people visit substack.com/@Jack Cashill, and also follow you on X.
Jason, before you go, can you just scroll back to what you just showed from my Substack page, the most recent article? This one, right?
Mm-hmm.
Let me just take 2 minutes to talk to you about what we're facing now. This happened on Thursday. I live in Kansas City. So this woman tries to set this warehouse on fire that had been scheduled to become an ICE detention center. That morning, ICE, the company, Platform Ventures, pulled out under duress of the deal. The woman doesn't get the memo. So that afternoon, she tries to burn it down. There just happens to be a TV crew there covering the larger story of the company pulling out. They capture her doing this completely, seeing it the whole time. They call the police. She leaves before the police comes. You can see her clearly. This is another story of a guy, Tesla burner. But so now we're 4 days later, and this story's totally disappeared from the news. The police won't call me back. The TV station won't call me back. This woman is escapes. She did more physical damage to that building than any single protester did to the Capitol on January 6th. And she's probably going to walk away. They're probably not even going to bother finding her. So, but you're right. Sometimes things fall in your lap. When you see them, you got to go after them. So,
Absolutely.
Hey, Jason, anytime, sir. Always good to talk to you.
Good to see you too, Jack. Thanks for joining me again. And don't forget, everybody, you can support Crowdsource the Truth on crowdsourcethetruth.substack.com or subscribestar.com or patreon.com.